So one of the things that really strikes me as odd as a psychologist, there's two things, I suppose, when I look at modern claims about identity. The first is that identity is subjectively defined. I think that is so utterly preposterous. I can't believe that we're even entertaining it as a culture. It's so idiotic. Now, let's say that you adopt an extremely liberal parenting orientation and your children start to push the boundaries. Well, you're not going to stop them. And so that means they're going to push the boundaries harder and harder. And that's going to make them more and more anxious because there's not enough structure. And then let's say they hit teenagehood and puberty. And maybe you're unfortunate. You have a girl who hits puberty a little early and she's a little immature and she's a little sensitive to negative emotion and maybe not quite as popular as she might be. And she's quite confused and anxious and she starts pushing the boundaries pretty damn hard on the gender identity front. And then you've got real trouble, especially if she's also being exposed to a passel of idiot teachers who are doing everything they possibly can to capitalize on her confusion. And so it seems to me that what we are seeing on the gender dysphoria front, which is a form of social contagion and a psychogenic epidemic, is an extension of boundary pushing behavior. It's so a girl can come up to her parent when she's 12 and do a bunch of things at the same time. She can say, well, I think maybe I'm a boy. Okay, so what exactly is going on there? Well, certainly a challenge to social authority. It's a challenge to parental authority. It's an expression of a deep discontent and a level of chaotic anxiety and confusion. And then it's also the only way, as far as I can tell, that the child can test the relationship between the teachers and their ideology, say gender-affirming ideology, and the rules at home that the parents are trying to abide by. Because the kids at school are going to be taught, look, everybody's got a subjectively defined identity, and you might not be as masculine or feminine as you've been led to believe. And anyone who tells you different is a detestable bigot to such a degree that you should actually keep all of this secret and never even talk to them. It's like, how the hell is a kid going to sort through all that without going home and saying something like, Mom, sometimes I think maybe I'm a girl? Like, because they're not going to be able to delineate this out in some complex philosophical manner. Adults can't bloody well do that.
The adolescent's job is to separate from the parents. And we know that adolescents are far more influenced by their peer group than their parents. And this is the agony for parents because they're at an age where parents should be letting go, should be widening that boundary so that the child can push against the boundary of the outside world more as they take this journey, which is from childhood to adulthood. It's not, it's a rocky road for a lot of teenagers, most, I would say. And so that pushing against the boundaries, part of that job is to reject the parents and reject the parents' values. So parents of adolescents are even more in a position where they're tearing their hair out because they know that if they're giving advice to their children, that's not the advice their kids are listening to. They're listening to what's going on in their peer group. So it's a huge thing for society to have been put on to this generation of children and that parents feel helpless about. And the parents' job in adolescence is really to tread that line, and particularly in this area of speaking the truth, giving their children facts. That is a responsibility of parents, and you may be the only person in that child's life who is doing that. And it's also to allow the child more freedom and more freedom of expression. So it's a real dance, and it's all about keeping up a good, strong relationship with that child and keeping communication channels open.
Right. Well, in some ways you could think about the model you used, which is, say, integration versus individuation, is that as the child becomes more autonomous, putting more stress on individuation makes more and more sense, right? Because you've already laid down the groundwork for their social acceptance. And then as they move into adolescence, first of all, they can't abide by your household rules entirely because they'd never leave home if that was the case, right? They have to have that drive towards independence, and that's going to mean establishing their own system of values in some sense so that they can move away from you and do that autonomously. And so they are going to be set against you in some real sense. The problem is that I suppose part of the problem that parents run into at the moment is that that's been weaponized. That proclivity has been weaponized in the name of this extremely strange gender ideology that insists that identity, well, we could take that apart a little bit. That might be useful. So one of the things that really strikes me as odd as a psychologist, there's two things, I suppose, when I look at modern claims about identity. The first is that identity is subjectively defined. I think that is so utterly preposterous. I can't believe that we're even entertaining it as a culture. It's so idiotic. Every single time I have a conversation with my wife, or with anyone else for that matter, but let's say with my wife, I'm negotiating my identity, just as she's negotiating hers, because we have our viewpoints and our proclivities for action, and we have each of us have our tendency to insist that our way is the right way. But if you're going to be around other people, you have to constantly negotiate that so that you can stand each other. And so a real identity is actually the ability to negotiate the transformation of your own identity in a social space. It has nothing to do with you subjectively defining your identity. Now, as far as I can tell, the only people who are unable to negotiate identity and who insist upon having it subjectively defined are literally 2 years old. Because according to Piaget, and there's some good research support for the basic outlines of his theory, 2-year-olds are too egocentric to negotiate a shared play space. So their identity is subjectively defined, and they're almost entirely hedonistically oriented, which means they run by whim, which everyone knows if you're around 2-year-olds, and they can't play with other children. Okay, so the idea that identity is subjectively defined is utterly preposterous, and it's actually an anti-truth, because if you try to define your identity subjectively, you are a bloody tyrant, and you're going to be an unpopular one too, and you deserve it. But then, secondarily, we have this other weird insistence, and I don't know why we've become so demented that we also accept this, that your identity is subjectively defined, but nonetheless, the core element of your identity is some immutable group characteristic, and the one we stress most is sexual attraction. And I suppose the secondary one is something like race. It's so peculiar that your identity is subjectively defined, but it's also boxed into this very narrow set of parameters, which is, well, the most important thing about you is who and to what degree, to whom and to what degree are you sexually attracted? It just leaves me speechless. Well, it doesn't, but you get my point.